A millionaire's life is about to reach its greatest success when an unexpected phone call changes everything. On the other end of the line, a desperate girl reveals she is lost with her newborn sister and has nowhere to go. Driven by a sense of urgency, the businessman leaves his work behind and sets out to find the girls, facing unfamiliar streets and a relentless storm. Chapter 1. The Call. In the heart of New York City, surrounded by glass walls that reflected the city's cloudy sky, Edward Menzies reviewed the final details of the contract that would change his life. At 50 years old, the entrepreneur had built Millionaire, one of the largest technology companies in the United States, with branches across North America, and now finally poised to conquer the European market. The meeting room on the top floor of the Fifth Avenue building was silent, only the sound of Edward's fingers typing on the keyboard and the muffled noise of the rain beginning to fall outside. The clock showed 5:45 p.m. In just over an hour, he would sign the contract with the German conglomerate that had been pursuing him for years. Edward adjusted his navy blue tie and ran a hand through his graying hair. His face, marked by subtle wrinkles around his eyes, maintained the serious expression that had accompanied him for years. Since the passing of his parents when he was young, Edward had dedicated himself exclusively to work. There had been no time for relationships, for building a family. Millionaire was his life. Mr. Menzies, the Reichman lawyers arrive in an hour. Denise, his trusted secretary for over 15 years, announced through the half-open door. "Do you need anything before then?" "No, Denise. Thank you. You can go home. The rain is getting worse." The woman hesitated for a moment. "You should do the same. A storm is forecast." Edward smiled slightly. That was the closest he got to having someone worry about him. "Right after the meeting, I promise." When Denise left, Edward turned his attention back to the window. The rain intensified, transforming the city into a diffuse landscape of lights and shadows. The New York sky, growing darker, heralded one of those typical summer storms. That's when the phone rang. Edward looked at the device with some irritation. He wasn't expecting any more calls. On the screen, an unknown number flashed insistently. Probably some salesperson or journalist trying to get information about the deal that had leaked to the specialized media. Edward almost ignored it, but something made him answer. "Edward Menzies," he replied dryly. On the other end of the line, silence. Then a breath. And then a child's voice, trembling. "Hello? Daddy?" Edward frowned. "I think you've dialed the wrong number." "We're in the rain, Daddy," the voice continued. "B is crying a lot. Will you be long?" Something in that child's voice made Edward sit upright. There was desperation, fear. "Listen, little one. My name is Edward. I'm not your father. You dialed the wrong number." A sob on the other end. "Sorry, sir. It's just that my dad's phone ran out of battery, and he gave me this number before he left. He said to call if anything happened." Edward checked his watch. Less than an hour until the most important meeting of his life. He should hang up, suggest the girl seek help, maybe call the police. But her voice held him in an inexplicable way. "Where are you? And how old are you?" "I'm 9 years old. My name is Julia. My little sister Bea is only 3 months old." Her voice lowered. "I don't really know where we are. Daddy said he was going to get medicine for Mommy and left us here near a pharmacy, but he hasn't come back." Edward stood up, feeling a pressure in his chest he had never experienced before. "How long has he been gone?" "A long time. It's getting dark. Bea won't stop crying and I'm scared. There are a lot of people on the street, but it's raining very hard now." Edward's pragmatic mind, accustomed to solving complex business problems, sprang into action. "Can you see any signs, any store names near you?" There was a pause. "There's a bakery called Golden Loaf and a clothing store named Elegance Boutique." Edward knew that area. It was a residential neighborhood in the North End, far from there. "Are you on Our Lady of Mercy Avenue? Near the river?" "I think so, sir." "There's a big river nearby." The entrepreneur felt a chill. That region often flooded quickly on stormy days. The rain that lashed the city that afternoon must already be causing problems. Edward called Denise on the intercom. "Cancel the meeting with the Germans." "What do you mean, Mr. Menzies?" "They're already on their way. Tell them I had a family emergency." "Reschedule for tomorrow morning." "But, sir, they have a flight booked to Berlin tomorrow afternoon. It was hard to get this time and—" Just do as I ask, Denise, he interrupted, with a firmness that surprised even himself. Meanwhile, he kept the girl on the line. Julia, are you sheltered from the rain? Yes, we're under a store awning, but it's closed. I'm cold and Bea is too. She's coughing. Edward grabbed his coat and car keys. Listen carefully. I'm coming to pick you up. Don't leave there, understood? Stay exactly where you are. But you're not my dad. No, I'm not, but I'll help you find him. I promise. In the elevator, Edward tried to understand what he was doing. He was risking the most important deal of his career for two unknown children. It made no sense. Still, he felt compelled by something greater than his usual rationality. The parking lot was practically empty at that hour. Edward ran to his black Mercedes, protecting his phone from the rain. The call remained active. Julia, are you still there? Yes, sir. I'm coming. Keep talking to me, okay? Tell me about your little sister. As the girl spoke about little Bea, Edward drove through the rain-congested city. Traffic was chaotic, as always in New York City on stormy days. People ran on the sidewalks, umbrellas folded in the strong wind and car headlights reflected in the rapidly forming puddles. Your mother, where is she? Edward asked, trying to understand more about the situation. Mommy's in the hospital. She's sick. Daddy said he needed to get money for her medicine, but it was dangerous to take us. He said he'd be quick. Edward felt a knot in his throat, a father's desperation trying to save his wife, leaving his daughters in a place he thought was safe. What could have happened? The rain increased in intensity. On the radio, the announcer warned of flooding in various parts of the city. Edward gripped the steering wheel tightly. He needed to reach those girls. Can you see if there's a number on the store where you are? Julia was silent for a few moments. There's a 254 on the door, I think. Great, Julia, you're very clever. I'm closer now. As Edward approached the address, traffic slowed even more. Some streets were already blocked by water. He had to make detours, increasing his anxiety. With each passing minute, his concern for the girls grew. What do you look like, Julia? What color is your hair? It's black and long. I'm wearing a pink shirt and Bea has a yellow blanket. Edward realized he was close. He recognized the Golden Loaf Bakery on the corner and slowed down, looking carefully among the people sheltering from the rain. That's when he saw them. Under the awning of a closed store, a dark-haired girl held a bundle against her chest. They were alone, visibly scared. Edward parked quickly, ignoring the no parking sign, and turned off the engine. Julia, he called, getting out of the car and facing the rain without caring about getting wet. It's me, Edward. The girl looked in his direction, her large dark eyes filled with fear and hope. When Edward reached them, he realized how vulnerable they were. Julia's clothes were damp, and little Bea, a frail baby with fair skin and closed eyes, trembled slightly under the blanket. I've come to get you, he said, taking off his jacket and covering both of them. Let's go somewhere safe. Julia hesitated, as if remembering the warnings she had surely heard about not trusting strangers. How do I know you're the man from the phone? Edward smiled, admiring the girl's shrewdness even in that situation. He showed her his phone with the call still active. It's me, Julia, and I'll take care of you until we find your father. The girl looked at her sister in her arms, then at the torrential rain, and finally at Edward. With a small nod of her head, she accepted the help. Edward led them to the car, carefully settling them in the back seat. He turned the heater to maximum and grabbed a bottle of water he kept in the glove compartment. Drink some. You need to hydrate. While Julia drank the water and offered a few drops to her sister, Edward analyzed his options. Should he take them to the police? But what if their father was involved in something illegal to get money, as Julia had hinted? The girl trusted him now, and Edward didn't want to betray that trust. Let's go to my house. There you can take a warm bath, eat something, and rest. In the meantime, we'll try to find out what happened to your father. Julia nodded silently, her eyes fixed on the foggy window, watching the city transform into a sea of diffuse lights under the relentless rain. Edward looked at them in the rearview mirror, feeling a strange mix of concern and determination. At that moment, the powerful entrepreneur Edward Menzies, known for his coldness and pragmatism in business, made a decision that would change his life forever. The multi-million-dollar contract, the German investors, Meantech's international expansion, all of it suddenly seemed secondary to what truly mattered. Those two helpless children in the back seat of his car needed him. New York City continued its chaotic routine under the rain, while Edward's black Mercedes cut through the flooded avenues towards the Upper East Side, where his penthouse was located. What the entrepreneur didn't know was that by answering that call he had taken the first step to rediscovering the meaning of the word family. Chapter 2. The Cold Apartment. The doorman of the luxurious building on Central Park. West widened his eyes when he saw Edward Menzies cross the lobby with two drenched children. In 15 years working there, Severin had never seen the entrepreneur accompanied by children, much less in that state. "Good evening, Mr. Menzies," he said, hurrying to help. "Do you need anything?" Edward hesitated for a moment. "Yes, Severin. Can you ask for extra towels to be sent up, and would you know where I can get diapers and baby formula at this hour?" The doorman, a middle-aged man with 3 children, nodded promptly. "My wife can provide them. We have a 6-month-old grandson." "I appreciate it. Send me the bill later." As they entered the private elevator, Julia held Bea tightly, looking in wonder at the golden buttons and the mirror that reflected her small, wet figure. Edward noticed that despite her fear, there was a curious sparkle in the girl's eyes. "Do you live here alone, sir?" The innocent question hit Edward hard. "Yes, just me." "It's very big for just one person," Julia observed with the sincerity only children possess. The duplex penthouse occupied the top 2 floors of the building, with panoramic views of Central Park. When the elevator doors opened directly into the main living room, Julia let out an exclamation of surprise. The space was vast, decorated with contemporary designer furniture in shades of grey and black. Large floor-to-ceiling windows showcased the city illuminated under the persistent rain. Abstract paintings by renowned artists adorned the walls, and a glass staircase led to the upper floor. Everything there screamed luxury, power, and loneliness. "Come, we need to get out of these wet clothes," Edward said, guiding them down the hallway. "You can use one of the guest rooms to shower and change." Julia looked around, hugging her sister against her chest. "Our whole house would fit in this room, you know?" Edward felt a knot in his throat. The contrast between his world and that of those children was striking. "Where do you live, Julia?" "In Liberty Hill. It's far from here." She paused. "Our house is small, but Mummy always made it pretty, with flowers and drawings I made at school. Now everything's different since she got sick." In the guest room, Edward opened the bathroom doors, turning on the bath. "Here, let the water warm up. I'll see if I can find something for you to wear while your clothes dry." He rummaged through the closets and found some clean T-shirts that could serve as improvised dresses for the girls. When he returned to the room, Julia had already undressed her sister and held her carefully on the bed. "She needs a clean diaper," Julia said, sounding much older than her 9 years. Edward nodded, feeling completely unprepared. "The doorman is getting some. You know how to take care of her." Julia smiled for the first time since he'd found her. "Of course I do. I've taken care of Bea since she was born. Mommy taught me everything." Something in that answer made Edward feel a mix of admiration and sadness. A 9-year-old child shouldn't have so much responsibility. "I'll prepare something for you to eat while you wait for the diapers." In the ultra-modern kitchen, rarely used as Edward usually ate in restaurants or ordered delivery, the entrepreneur frantically searched for something suitable for a child and a baby. He found some crackers, milk, and fruit. It wasn't much, but it would suffice for now. The intercom rang. It was Severin with the diapers and other baby items. "My wife also sent some homemade baby food she makes for our grandson," the doorman explained. "And some clothes our son no longer uses." Edward took the bag, genuinely touched by the gesture. "Thank you, Severin, truly." When he returned to the room, he found Julia coming out of the bathroom, with Bea wrapped in a towel. The girl had already bathed and was wearing one of Edward's T-shirts, which looked more like a dress on her small body. Her dark hair, still damp, framed a delicate face with large, expressive eyes. "I brought diapers, clothes, and food for you." Julia took the bag with gratitude. "Do you know how to change a diaper?" Edward smiled awkwardly. "Actually, no. I've never had children." "Why not?" she asked, skillfully changing her sister's diaper. The question caught Edward off guard. Why had he never had children? There was never time. There was always a meeting, a trip, a contract. Mentech consumed every second of his life. "I guess I never found the right moment," he replied. knowing it was a half-truth. Julia finished dressing her sister in one of the outfits Severin's wife had sent and picked her up. There, now she needs to eat. Bea used to breastfeed from Mommy, but now she takes formula. Is there milk in the bag? Edward showed her the can of powdered milk Severin had sent. Yes, but I don't know how to prepare it. It's easy. I'll teach you. In the kitchen, Edward watched fascinated as Julia, with impressive naturalness, instructed him on how to prepare the bottle. The girl tested the milk's temperature on her wrist before starting to feed her sister, who avidly sucked on the nipple. How long since you last ate? Edward asked, concerned by the baby's evident appetite. Since this morning. Daddy left early and said he'd be back soon. Julia bit her lip, trying to hold back tears. He's never been gone this long before. Edward served crackers and fruit to Julia, who ate while holding the bottle for her sister. He sat opposite them, trying to process the entire situation. Julia, tell me more about your father. What exactly happened? The girl hesitated, as if weighing how much she could trust him. Daddy's a driver. He drove for a company, but he got fired when Mommy got sick. He had to spend a lot of time in the hospital with her. And what illness does your mother have? It's something with her heart. She needs an expensive surgery. Daddy was saving money, but it was never enough. Julia paused, adjusting Bea in her arms. Then a man appeared offering a job that paid very well. Daddy didn't want to accept at first, but after the doctor said Mommy got worse, he ended up accepting. Edward felt a chill run down his spine. What kind of job was that? I don't really know. Daddy just said it was quick but dangerous. Today he left saying it was the last job, that after this he would have enough money for Mommy's surgery. The story began to make sense. A desperate man willing to do anything to save his wife ends up taking a job in something possibly illicit. And which hospital is your mother in? St. Martha's Hospital in the East End. We visited her yesterday. Julia finished feeding Bea, who was now asleep in her arms. Do you think something happened to my dad? Edward didn't know what to say. His suspicions pointed to something bad, but he didn't want to scare the girl even more. I'm sure he's doing everything he can to get back to you, he replied, trying to sound convinced. Tomorrow morning we'll find out what happened. He led the girls back to the guest room, making the bed so they could sleep comfortably. Julia laid Bea in the center of the king-size bed, placing pillows around her so the baby wouldn't roll off. Do you need anything else? Edward asked. Julia looked at him with tired but still attentive eyes. Can you tell a story? Daddy always tells one before we go to sleep. Edward sat on the edge of the bed, trying to remember a children's story. It had been so long since he'd thought about such things. His own childhood seemed so distant, almost unreal. Finally, he began to narrate an improvised version of Hansel and Gretel, replacing the wicked witch with less frightening challenges and ensuring a happy ending where the siblings returned home safely. When he finished, Julia's eyes were heavy with sleep, embracing her sister. Thank you for helping us, Mr. Edward, she murmured. You seem like a fairy tale prince, only real. Something in Edward's chest warmed with those innocent words. He adjusted the blanket over the two and left the room, leaving the door ajar. In the living room, Edward picked up his phone. He had dozens of missed calls from Denise, the lawyers, and the German executives. The meeting had been a disaster, as far as he could tell from the messages. The Germans were furious about the sudden cancellation and threatened to pull out of the deal. Years of work, billions in investments, Menatech's international expansion, all of it was now at risk. At any other time, Edward would be in a panic, frantically calling to save the deal. But strangely, he couldn't bring himself to care enough. Instead, he used his contacts to get information about St. Martha's Hospital. He managed to speak to a doctor friend who promised to check on the girl's mother's case the next morning. Then, he began to research what could have happened in the Our Lady of Mercy Avenue region that day. News reports spoke of floods, stranded people, but nothing specific that could indicate the father's whereabouts. Edward spent hours sitting on the sofa, looking at the city through the windows. The rain continued to lash New York City, and the metropolis's lights flickered like distant stars. He thought about his life, how he had built an empire at the cost of his own humanity. His luxury apartment, so admired by everyone, had never seemed so empty and lifeless as it did that night. From time to time, he got up to check on the girls. They slept soundly, embracing each other. forming a small island of innocence amidst the ocean of uncertainties. Around 3 in the morning, the phone rang. It was an unknown number. Edward answered immediately, fearing he would wake the children. "Edward Menzies," he whispered. "Mr. Menzies?" The male voice on the other end sounded tense, tired. "Did you answer a call from my daughter earlier today?" Edward's heart raced. "Yes, are you Julia and Bee's father?" "My name is Robert Allen. Are my daughters with you? Are they okay?" "They're safe and sleeping now," Edward replied, relieved to finally make contact with the girl's father. "What happened to you?" Julia was very worried. There was a long silence. "It's complicated. I'm at City General Hospital. There was an accident. I need you to take care of my daughters until tomorrow, if possible." "Of course, they can stay here as long as necessary," Edward replied without hesitation. "But what exactly happened? Are you hurt?" Robert sighed deeply. "Yes, but nothing serious. The problem is, the police are involved. I did something I shouldn't have, Mr. Menzies, out of desperation. My wife is dying, and I had no way to pay for her treatment." Edward closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the man's confession. "I understand more than you imagine, Robert. Don't worry about the girls. Tomorrow we can talk in person and see how to resolve this. You don't even know me. Why are you helping my family?" The question echoed in Edward's mind. Why indeed was he so involved with this unknown family? What had led him to risk the biggest deal of his life to help 2 lost children? "Because your daughters need help," he finally replied. "And because perhaps I needed it too." After hanging up, Edward went back to check on the girls. Bea had woken up and was whimpering softly. Not wanting to disturb Julia's sleep, Edward carefully picked up the baby, surprising himself with his own naturalness in doing so. He took the little one to the living room and sat in the armchair, gently rocking her. Bea stopped crying, looking at him with large, curious eyes. "Hello, little one," Edward murmured. "Your father will be back soon." The baby gripped one of his fingers with surprising strength, bringing a smile to the entrepreneur's face. A strange, warm feeling spread through his chest, a sensation he hadn't experienced in decades. The feeling of being needed by someone, of being important not for his money or power, but simply for being there, offering comfort and security. Through the window, Edward saw that the rain was finally subsiding. The sky began to lighten slightly, announcing that the new day would not be long in coming. A day that he knew would change everything. In the silence of the luxurious apartment, once cold and impersonal, Edward Menzies cradled a child he hadn't even known hours before. Meantech, the multi-million-dollar contract, the reputation of a ruthless businessman, none of it seemed to matter at that moment. The heart that for years had only beaten for business success now found a new rhythm, synchronizing with the soft breathing of little Bea in his arms. The apartment, for the first time since Edward bought it, no longer seemed an empty space filled with expensive furniture and works of art. There was life there now, fragile and precious, demanding much more than money could buy. Chapter 3. Discoveries. Dawn in New York City brought with it a clear sky after the previous night's storm. Edward had fallen asleep in the armchair with Bea in his arms, a fact he himself would have considered impossible just 24 hours earlier. "Mr. Edward?" Julia's soft voice woke him. The girl stood before him, her hair disheveled and her eyes still heavy with sleep. For an instant, Edward felt disoriented, as if in a dream. "Good morning, Julia," he replied, adjusting Bea, who was still sleeping. "Did you sleep well?" The girl nodded, approaching to check on her sister. "Did Bea wake up during the night?" "Yes, but I didn't want to wake you. We stayed here talking, didn't we, little one?" Edward smiled at the baby, who was beginning to stir. "Your father called." Julia's eyes widened. "Really? Where is he?" "Is he coming to pick us up today?" Edward hesitated. How to explain to a child that her father was in a hospital, under police surveillance, possibly about to be arrested for something desperate he had done to try to save her mother? "He had a small accident and is in the hospital, but nothing serious," he explained, opting for a simplified version of the truth. "We'll visit him later. And Mommy, can we see her too?" "Of course," Edward replied, carefully getting up with Bea in his arms. "But first, how about a decent breakfast? You must be hungry." In the kitchen, Edward handed Bea to Julia and began to prepare what he could with the few available ingredients. Eggs, bread, some fruit. It wasn't much, but it was better than the crackers from the night before. "Do you always wake up this early?" he asked the girl who watched his movements in the kitchen intently. "Yes, to make Daddy's breakfast before he goes to work. Then I take Bea to the community daycare and go to school." Edward stopped what he was doing. "And who takes care of you when your father is in the hospital with your mother?" "Mrs. Zephyr, our neighbor. But she also works, so she only stays with us at night." The family's situation was more complicated than Edward imagined. A 9-year-old child practically alone caring for a 3-month-old baby, while the father struggled to save the sick mother. "Julia, would you like to tell me more about your mother? What's her name and how long has she been sick?" As they ate, Julia told him about Teresa, her mother, a public school teacher who had always loved books and music. According to the girl, her mother began to feel unwell during Bea's pregnancy, but doctors didn't detect the heart problem until delivery, when she almost lost her life. The doctors said she needs a special surgery, but the public health system takes too long, and she doesn't have that much time to wait. Julia looked at her sister as she spoke. "Daddy tried everything. He sold our car, took out a loan, did odd jobs on weekends, but it was never enough." Edward listened attentively, an idea beginning to form in his mind. While Julia finished breakfast, he made some important calls. The first was to Denise, his secretary. "Denise, I need you to cancel all my appointments today. Mr. Menzies, the Germans are furious. They demand a meeting this morning or they will cancel the deal definitively." Edward took a deep breath. "Tell them I have an unavoidable family emergency. If they want to wait until tomorrow, fine. If not, they can find another partner in the United States." The silence on the other end of the line showed Denise's shock. In 20 years of working with Edward, she had never seen him give up an important deal. "Are you all right, sir?" "Better than ever, actually. Oh, and Denise, I need you to send me some children's clothes for a 9-year-old girl and a 3-month-old baby." The second call was to his doctor friend at St. Martha's Hospital, Dr. Paul Thompson, head of cardiology. "Edward, I checked on the patient you asked me about. Teresa Allen, 35, severe postpartum cardiomyopathy. She really needs complex surgery that the public health system cannot provide in a timely manner." "How much would that surgery cost at a private clinic, Paul?" The doctor hesitated. "We're talking about something between $200,000 and $300,000, considering the surgery, specialized team, ICU, and recovery." "Why, do you know the family?" "Let's say yes. I want to transfer her to Cedars Lebanon Hospital today. Prepare the necessary documentation." "Edward, do you realize what you're doing? That's a lot of money to invest in strangers." The entrepreneur looked at Julia, who was playing with Bea on the living room sofa, both now dressed in the clothes Severin had managed to get. "Some things are worth more than money, Paul." The third call was to his lawyer, Dr. Richard Miller, one of New York City's best criminal lawyers. "Richard, I need your help with a delicate case. A man possibly involved in something illicit, detained at City General Hospital. Name Robert Allen. I'll check immediately. What's your interest in this case?" "It's a little complicated. Let's say I'm helping his family. He has 2 small daughters and his wife is seriously ill." After the calls, Edward turned his attention back to the girls. "Julia, shall we get ready? Soon a lady will arrive bringing new clothes for you, and then we'll go see your mother at the hospital." The girl's eyes lit up. "Really? We're going to see Mommy?" "Yes, and we might have good news for her." While waiting for Denise, Edward showed his book collection to Julia, impressed by the girl's interest in reading. She said her mother was a literature teacher and always encouraged a love for books. "This was my favorite when I was a child," Edward said, taking an old copy of The Little Prince from the shelf. Julia touched the cover with reverence. "Mommy used to read it to me before bed. Now I read to Bea, even if she doesn't understand yet." Denise's arrival interrupted the moment. The secretary could barely hide her surprise at seeing her boss, always so formal, sitting on the library floor with 2 children. "Mr. Menzies, I brought what you asked for." Edward introduced Denise to the girls and showed them the bags of new clothes she had bought. Julia looked in wonder at the colorful dresses, shoes, and accessories she would never be able to afford. "Is all this for us?" "Of course," Edward replied. "You can't visit your mother in that huge T-shirt, can you?" While Julia tried on the clothes, Denise pulled Edward aside. "Are you going to tell me what's going on? Who are these children? And why are you risking the Deal with the Germans because of them? Edward smiled in a way Denise had never seen before. There was a lightness in his gaze, a serenity that contrasted with his usual entrepreneurial tension. Honestly, I can't even explain it myself. I just know that for the first time in years, I feel like I'm doing something that truly matters. After getting ready, Edward, Julia, and Bea headed to St. Martha's Hospital. On the way, the entrepreneur superficially explained to the girl that he was helping to transfer her mother to a better hospital, where she would receive the necessary treatment more quickly. But isn't that expensive? Daddy said we needed a lot of money. Don't worry about that now, Julia. Let's focus on getting your mother better, okay? At the hospital, Edward was met by Dr. Paul, who had already begun preparations for Teresa's transfer. Before entering the room, he knelt to Julia's height. Your mother is very weak, so we can't stay long, but I want you to know that we are doing everything to get her well soon. Julia nodded solemnly, holding Bea firmly. You're like a guardian angel, aren't you? Mommy always says angels appear when we need them most. Those simple words touched Edward deeply. He had never considered himself a religious man, or even particularly good. His values had always been linked to success, power, conquest. Being compared to an angel by that innocent child caused a mix of emotion and embarrassment. Teresa's room was simple, with white walls and a single vase of wilting flowers on the bedside table. The woman lying in bed looked much older than her 35 years. Her pale face and dull hair contrasted with Julia's memory of a vibrant, lively mother. "Mommy!" Julia exclaimed softly, approaching the bed with Bea. Teresa slowly opened her eyes. A weak smile lit up her face when she saw her daughters. "My loves, you came." Edward stood in the doorway, feeling like an intruder in that intimate moment. He watched as Julia carefully placed Bea next to her mother on the bed, so Teresa could touch her youngest daughter. "Julia, who is this gentleman with you?" Teresa asked, finally noticing Edward's presence. The girl smiled. "It's Mr. Edward. He helped us when we got lost in the rain yesterday, and now he's taking you to a better hospital, where they'll do the surgery you need." Teresa's tired eyes turned to Edward, full of confusion and distrust. "Who are you? Where is Robert?" Edward approached the bed, maintaining a respectful distance. "Mrs. Allen, I'm Edward Menzies. Your husband had a small accident yesterday and couldn't pick up the girls. I found them and took them to my house. Your husband is fine, just a little hurt. He knows we're here." Teresa tried to sit up, visibly agitated. "An accident? And how did you know where to find my daughters?" "Mommy, I called the number Daddy left when he didn't come back," Julia explained. "It was Mr. Edward's number." Edward realized the confusion. Robert had probably given another person's number to his daughter, but Julia ended up dialing wrong and calling his cell phone. A mistake that would change all their lives. "Mrs. Allen, I know you must be confused and worried, but I want you to know that your daughters are safe and that I'm here to help your family. Dr. Paul must have already explained that we're transferring you to Cedars Lebanon Hospital, where you'll receive the best possible treatment. But, why? We can't pay for this. Don't worry about costs now. Your recovery is what's important." Dr. Paul entered the room, interrupting the conversation. "Teresa, everything is ready for your transfer. The ambulance will arrive in half an hour." While the doctor explained the procedures, Edward received a call from his lawyer. He stepped out of the room to answer. "Richard, what did you find out?" "Your man is indeed at City General, Edward. He was involved in a robbery that went wrong. He has minor injuries but is in police custody. The situation is complicated but not impossible. I want you to get him out of there today," Edward ordered. "Use your contacts, do whatever it takes." "Edward, we're talking about a crime. I can't just—" "I'm not asking for anything illegal, Richard. I want you to offer bail if possible. If not, prepare the best defense. This man has a dying wife and 2 small daughters depending on him." As he hung up, Edward saw Julia standing in the hallway, looking at him with apprehensive eyes. "My dad's in jail, isn't he?" "That's what the man said," Edward sighed, approaching the girl. There was no point trying to protect her from the truth. She had already understood. "Your father is detained, yes, Julia, but don't worry, my lawyer will help him. He did something wrong, but he did it for a good reason. To save your mother." Julia hugged Bea tighter. "Is he going to prison?" Edward sat next to her on the hallway bench. "I don't know yet, but I'll do everything in my power to help him. I promise. The girl was silent for a few moments, processing the information. Then, to Edward's surprise, she leaned her head on his shoulder. "Thank you," she said simply. That small gesture of trust meant more to Edward than all the multi-million-dollar contracts he had ever closed in his life. There in that hospital corridor, with a child trusting him completely, Edward Menzies felt that he was finally doing something truly significant. Teresa's transfer went smoothly. Edward accompanied the ambulance with the girls to Cedars Lebanon Hospital, one of New York City's most prestigious, known for serving the city's elite. During the journey, Julia remained quiet, absorbing everything that was happening. Occasionally, she looked at Edward with an expression that mixed gratitude and curiosity. "Mr. Edward, you're very rich, aren't you?" The direct question caught the entrepreneur off guard. "Well, I'm in a comfortable financial position, yes. And yet you helped us, why?" "We have nothing to give you in return." Edward reflected on that seemingly simple yet deeply complex question. Why was he doing all this? What drove him to dedicate so much time, money, and effort to a family he hadn't even known until the day before? "You know, Julia, sometimes we gain more when we give without expecting anything in return, and you've already given me something very valuable." "What?" Edward smiled, looking at the two sisters. "You reminded me of what truly matters in life." At Cedars Lebanon Hospital, Teresa was immediately taken to a private suite, where a team of cardiologists was already waiting for her. Edward stayed with the girls in the luxurious waiting room, so different from the simple environment of the public hospital. "Wow, it looks like a hotel," Julia exclaimed, looking at the comfortable sofas and the flat-screen TV on the wall. "Your mother will be very well cared for here," Edward assured her. "The best doctors in the country work at this hospital." While they waited, Edward's phone rang again. It was Richard, his lawyer. "Edward, I spoke with the detective inspector in charge of the case. Robert Allen participated in a jewelry store robbery yesterday, but something went wrong. He ended up injured and was captured, but no one else was seriously hurt. The detective inspector understood the situation when I explained about his wife's illness and his small daughters." "And then?" We managed to get a bail hearing for today. With the commitment that he cooperates with the investigation and returns his share of the stolen goods, there is a possibility of provisional release." Edward felt immense relief. "Great, I'll be there. I want to speak with the detective inspector personally." As he hung up, Edward explained to Julia that he would need to leave for a few hours to resolve her father's situation. He left the girls in the care of a pediatric nurse, specially assigned to them, and promised to return as soon as possible. On the way to the police station, Edward reflected on how his life had changed in less than 24 hours. The corporate empire he had built over decades now seemed distant and less important compared to the human drama he was involved in. For the first time, Edward Menzies, the feared CEO of Menatech, felt truly alive. Not for power, not for money, not for recognition, but for genuinely helping those in need, for making a real difference in the lives of real people with real problems. And Julia's innocent question echoed in his mind. "Why did you help us if we have nothing to give you in return?" Because perhaps deep down, he had always known that his life of material success was empty, without true human connections. And now, through a misdialed number and destiny, he had found a purpose that no business achievement could offer. Chapter 4. The Encounter. The 77th Precinct of New York City Police Department exuded that characteristic smell of old paper, strong coffee, and cheap disinfectant. Edward Menzies, in his impeccable suit and Italian shoes, stood out as a strange figure in that environment. The officers watched him with curiosity as he waited in Detective Inspector Leo Roberts' anteroom. "Mr. Menzies," the clerk called. "The detective inspector will see you now." Edward followed the woman to a small room, with old furniture and walls covered with diplomas and commendations. Behind a desk cluttered with case files, Detective Inspector Leo Roberts, a middle-aged black man with graying temples and a sharp gaze, awaited him. "Mr. Menzies, your lawyer told me about your special interest in Mr. Allen's case. I confess I'm curious to understand why." Edward sat in the chair indicated by the detective inspector. "It's a long story, Inspector. I met Mr. Allen's daughters yesterday under unusual circumstances. They were alone in the rain, lost. And you, one of the country's most important businessmen, personally decided to help these unknown children? Forgive my distrust, but that's not very common. Edward smiled slightly. Believe me, Inspector, I'm as surprised as you are by my own actions. But after learning about that family situation, I couldn't simply ignore it. The detective inspector leaned back in his chair, studying Edward with analytical eyes. Mr. Allen confessed to participating in a jewelry store robbery in the gardens. According to him, it was an act of desperation to pay for his wife's treatment, who has a severe heart condition. And that's true, Edward confirmed. His wife, Teresa Allen, is currently hospitalized at Cedars Lebanon Hospital, awaiting life-saving surgery that I am financing. The detective inspector raised his eyebrows, visibly surprised. Why would you do that, sir? Edward reflected for a moment before answering. How to explain something he didn't even fully understand himself. Inspector, I've spent my entire life accumulating wealth and power. I built an empire, but I lived as a lonely man. Yesterday, when I found those two girls, Julia, 9 years old, taking care of her 3-month-old baby sister, something inside me changed. I realized that all my money meant nothing if I couldn't make a real difference in someone's life. Leo Roberts watched him in silence, as if weighing every word. Finally, he stood up and walked to the window. My father was a driver like Mr. Allen. He worked 16 hours a day to support our family. When my mother got sick, he also became desperate. The detective inspector turned to Edward. The difference is that my father got help. A generous employer paid for her treatment. That's why I'm here today wearing this uniform and not on the other side of the law. Edward understood the implicit message. We all deserve a second chance, Inspector. Agreed. Leo sat back down. Mr. Allen has no criminal record. He's a hard-working man who made a serious mistake out of desperation. The judge at the bail hearing is a reasonable man. With your influence and your lawyers, I believe we can get him released on bail. And what about the stolen goods? They were mostly recovered. Mr. Allen was caught before meeting the fence. That counts in his favor. Edward felt a weight lift from his shoulders. When can I see him? Right now, if you wish. He's in the infirmary. The arm injury needed a few stitches. Robert Allen lay on a simple gurney, his right arm bandaged. He was a thin man, approximately 40 years old, with tired eyes and an unshaven beard. Seeing Edward, he quickly sat up, an anxious expression on his face. Mr. Menzies, how are my daughters? And Teresa? Edward approached the gurney. They're all well, Mr. Allen. Your daughters are at the hospital with their mother. Teresa has been transferred to Cedars Lebanon Hospital, where she will receive the necessary surgery. Robert covered his face with his free hand, trying to hide the tears that began to fall. Why are you doing all this? You don't know us, you owe us nothing. The same question Julia had asked earlier. Edward sat on the edge of the gurney. Mr. Allen, Robert, sometimes life puts us on unexpected paths. Yesterday I was about to close the biggest deal of my career when your daughter accidentally called my number. I could have ignored it, but something made me answer. And when I found Julia holding little B in that rain, I knew I couldn't just leave them and go on with my life. Robert looked at Edward with a mixture of gratitude and shame. You saved my daughters, and now you're saving my wife. How can I thank you? By not doing anything stupid like robbing a jewelry store again, Edward replied with a half smile. Your family needs you, free and well. Robert lowered his head. I've never done anything like this before. I've always worked honestly. But when the doctor said Teresa might not make it if she didn't have surgery soon, and the health insurance denied coverage, I lost my head. I understand the desperation, Edward said, but now we have to focus on resolving this situation. My lawyer is working to get your provisional release. You will cooperate with the investigation, and with luck you can face the charges while free. And then, no company will want to hire a former convict. Edward had thought about that too. I have a proposal for you, Robert. My company, Millionaire, has a social reintegration program. I can guarantee you a position there, with a fair salary and health insurance that will cover the ongoing care Teresa will need after surgery. Robert's eyes widened, incredulous. You would give me a job? Even after what I did? We all make mistakes, Robert. The important thing is to learn from them and move forward. Your daughters need a present father, and Teresa needs you by her side. The bail hearing took place that same afternoon. Thanks to Edward's influence and Richard's skill, Robert was granted provisional release. He would have to wear an electronic ankle monitor, report to the courthouse monthly, and perform community service. But he could be with his family during Teresa's treatment. Edward took Robert directly to Cedars Lebanon Hospital. On the way, the two men, so different in their backgrounds and trajectories, talked like old friends. "Julia told me you never had children," Robert commented. "Is that true?" Edward nodded, keeping his eyes on the road. "I never found time to build a family. The company was always my priority. With all due respect, Mr. Menzies, you missed the best part of life. Having a family, no matter how difficult, is the greatest wealth a man can have." Robert's simple words caused a tightening in Edward's chest. It was true. All his empire, all his money, hadn't brought him a tenth of the joy he felt seeing Julia smile or cradling little Bea in his arms. At the hospital, the scene of Robert's reunion with his daughters moved even the most experienced nurses. Julia ran into her father's arms as soon as she saw him, and Robert, with tears in his eyes, hugged his daughter tightly, while holding little Bea in his other arm. "Daddy, you're back." "I knew you'd come back." Edward watched from a distance, feeling a strange mix of joy and emptiness. Joy at having helped reunite that family. Emptiness knowing that his part in that story would eventually end. After all, what else could he do? They had their family complete again. Teresa was conscious when Robert entered her room. Edward stood at the door, witnessing the emotional reunion of the couple. Robert briefly explained what had happened, omitting the sordid details and how Edward had helped them. "Mr. Menzies," Teresa called in a weak voice, "could you come closer?" Edward entered the room feeling somewhat out of place in that family moment. "I want to thank you for everything you've done for my family," Teresa said, extending a pale, fragile hand. "Robert told me how you took care of our daughters and are paying for my treatment. I don't know how we can ever repay you." Edward gently took her hand. "There's no need for repayment, Mrs. Allen. I just want to see you recovered and reunited with your family. Please call me Teresa," she smiled faintly, "and come visit us when I'm better. I make a stew that they say is the best in the neighborhood." The simple, sincere invitation touched Edward deeply. In his social circle, invitations were always formal, driven by interests and appearances. Teresa's invitation was genuine. She truly wanted his presence, not his status or money. It would be a pleasure. "Teresa." The doctors entered the room, announcing that they needed to prepare Teresa for some preoperative tests. Edward took the opportunity to withdraw, promising to return the next day. "Mr. Edward, are you leaving?" Julia's voice stopped him in the hallway. "I need to take care of a few things, Julia, but I'll be back tomorrow to see how your mother is doing." The girl approached, holding something in her hands. "I made this for you while I was waiting." It was a colorful drawing made with markers borrowed from the nurse. It showed 5 stick figures. A man in a suit, clearly Edward. A man, a woman in a bed, presumably Teresa, a girl and a baby. Above, in colorful letters, was written, "Our family and our guardian angel." Edward felt a lump in his throat as he took the drawing. "It's beautiful, Julia, thank you. Did you really like it?" "It didn't turn out very good because I didn't have all the colors I wanted. It's perfect. I'll cherish it." Julia hesitated for a moment, then suddenly hugged Edward. "Thank you for bringing my dad back." That spontaneous hug, the warmth of that child who trusted him completely, brought Edward an emotion he had never experienced. He returned the hug, feeling his eyes moist. "You're welcome, little one. You're welcome." As he left the hospital, Edward looked again at Julia's drawing. Our family and our guardian angel. That simple drawing had become his talisman, a constant reminder of what truly mattered. In his car, before starting the engine, Edward received a call from Denise. "Mr. Menzies, the Germans have decided to wait until tomorrow, but they made it clear that it will be their last chance." Edward looked at Julia's drawing on the passenger seat. "Denise, prepare all the documents. We'll close this deal tomorrow." "Thank goodness. I was worried you would give up the biggest deal in our history." "I won't give up, Denise. But some priorities have changed. Starting tomorrow, I want you to include free time every afternoon in my calendar and research social programs for children and needy families." The silence on the other end of the line showed his secretary's shock. "Social programs, sir? Are you all right?" Edward smiled, starting the car. "I've never been better, Denise. Never been better. On the way home, Edward purposely drove past the spot where he had found Julia and Bea the night before. The city had already returned to its normal rhythm after the storm, and there was no trace of the drama that had unfolded there. To hurried passers-by, it was just another spot in gigantic New York City. For Edward, it was the place where his life had changed forever. Upon arriving at his apartment, the feeling of emptiness that always greeted him seemed even more intense. Less than 24 hours earlier, that sterile, impersonal space had been filled by the presence of 2 children, momentarily transforming it into a home. Edward walked to the guest room where Julia and Bea had slept. The sheet was still rumpled, and a small hair ribbon that Julia had worn was forgotten on the pillow. He picked it up, feeling a strange melancholy. In the kitchen, the bottle he had used to feed Bea was still in the sink. The crackers Julia had eaten remained on the table. Small traces of the life that had briefly inhabited that apartment. Edward sat on the sofa, looking at the city through the huge windows. New York City glittered with millions of lights, each representing a life, a story, a family. For years he had observed that landscape with the detachment of someone viewing only a backdrop. Now he saw the people behind the lights. His phone rang again. It was Richard, his lawyer. "Edward, everything is set with Mr. Allen's case. I spoke with the prosecutor, and we reached a very favorable agreement. He will be charged with attempted robbery, but with all possible mitigating circumstances. The sentence will probably be fully converted into community service." "Great, Richard. Thank you. May I ask you something? What led you to get so involved in this case? I've never seen you dedicate yourself like this to anything that wasn't business." Edward looked at Julia's drawing, now carefully placed on the coffee table. "Let's just say I discovered that some investments are worth more than money." After hanging up, Edward took an empty picture frame from his shelf and put Julia's drawing inside it. It was the first truly personal object in his living room. A colorful reminder that, behind all the material success, there was an emptiness he was only now beginning to understand. That night, Edward Menzies, the powerful CEO of Millionaire, slept clutching the small hair ribbon forgotten by Julia, dreaming of a life different from the one he had built for himself. A life where success was not measured by contracts or bank account numbers, but by a child's smile and the ability to make a difference in someone's life. A life that at 50, he was beginning to glimpse as possible. Chapter 5. New Paths. The meeting with the German executives began exactly at 9 a.m. in Millionaire's main conference room. Edward Menzies entered the room with his usual confident demeanor, but something in his gaze was different, a serenity that did not match the tension of the moment. "Gentlemen, I apologize for yesterday's unforeseen circumstance. I had an unavoidable family emergency," Edward explained, sitting at the head of the long glass table. Hans Müller, CEO of Reichmann Tech, frowned. "I didn't know you had a family, Mr. Menzies. From what we researched, you are single and childless." "There are many forms of family, Mr. Müller," Edward replied with a slight smile. "But let's get down to business." The negotiation lasted 4 intense hours. The Germans, still irritated by the previous day's cancellation, proved inflexible on several points. At any other time in his career, Edward would have stressed, pressured, perhaps even threatened to break off the deal. But today he maintained a disconcerting calm, as if something much larger than that contract occupied his thoughts. "Mr. Menzies, our final offer is 15% below the value initially discussed," Müller announced. Clearly expecting an explosion of indignation, Edward looked at his watch. Almost 1 p.m. He had promised Julia he would visit her mother at the hospital that afternoon. "I accept," he simply said, to the shock of everyone in the room, including his own team. "Provided we close now and include the social responsibility clause I mentioned." Müller blinked, confused. "You accept a reduction of 120 million euros in the deal value?" "Yes. Provided we allocate 5% of the joint venture's annual revenue to social projects supporting needy families in the United States. It's a non-negotiable condition." The German looked at his advisors, surprised by the turnaround. Millionaire had never shown any special interest in social responsibility before. It was known, in fact, for its relentless pursuit of maximum profit. What happened to the Edward Menzies we knew? The one who wouldn't yield an inch in negotiations? Edward smiled, recalling Julia's colorful drawing. Let's just say he found something more valuable than money. The deal was closed on terms that a week earlier Edward would never have accepted. But strangely, he felt more victorious than ever. The social clause he imposed would guarantee resources for assistance programs for vulnerable families like Robert and Teresa's. As soon as the meeting ended, Edward left Denise in charge of finalizing the paperwork and headed to the hospital. On the way, he stopped at a toy store and bought gifts for Julia and Bea, an illustrated storybook and a colorful musical mobile. At Cedars Lebanon Hospital, he found the family reunited in Teresa's room. Robert was sitting by the bed, holding his wife's hand, while Julia played with Bea on the small sofa. The family scene touched Edward deeply. "Mr. Edward," Julia exclaimed when she saw him running to hug him. "Mommy's having surgery tomorrow. The doctors said everything will be fine." Edward smiled, returning the girl's hug. "That's great news, Julia. I brought something for you." He handed over the gifts, watching with pleasure the girl's joyful expression as she received the book. "The Little Prince, just like yours." "Look, Mommy." Teresa smiled from her hospital bed. She was still pale and weaker than usual, but there was a spark of hope in her eyes that hadn't been there the day before. "Mr. Menzies, once again, thank you for everything you're doing." Edward approached the bed. "Please call me Edward. There's nothing to thank me for. How are you feeling about the surgery tomorrow?" "A little nervous but confident. The doctors here are wonderful and explained everything in detail." She squeezed Robert's hand. "And now with my family reunited, I feel like I can face anything." Robert, visibly moved, stood up to greet Edward. "I got special authorization to accompany Teresa during surgery tomorrow, thanks to your lawyer. I don't know how to thank you." "No need to thank me. I just want to see your family reunited and happy." Edward hesitated for a moment. "By the way, I wanted to talk about the job I mentioned. When Teresa recovers and you've resolved your legal situation, there's a position waiting for you at Menatech." Robert's eyes widened. "At your company, but I don't have the qualifications to work in technology." Edward smiled. "Our executive vehicle fleet needs experienced drivers. The salary is good, the health insurance is excellent, and the hours are flexible. Important for someone with a family. Plus, we offer scholarships for employees who want to improve themselves. If you want to learn about technology, you'll have that opportunity." Teresa looked at her husband with tears in her eyes. "Robert, that's wonderful. But why would you do this for me?" Robert asked, still suspicious of so much generosity. "I'm technically an ex-detainee." "Because I believe in second chances," Edward replied simply, "and because your daughters taught me a valuable lesson about what truly matters in life." Julia, who was listening to the conversation while flipping through her new book, approached Edward. "Mr. Edward, can you have dinner at our house when Mommy's well? She makes a chocolate cake that's the best in the world." Edward knelt to be at the girl's level. "It would be a pleasure, Julia. I can't wait to try that cake. And you can bring your family too," she continued. "Your children can play with me and Bea." A momentary silence hung in the room. Robert and Teresa exchanged embarrassed glances, knowing Edward had no family. "Actually, Julia, I live alone," Edward explained gently. "I don't have a wife or children." The girl frowned, as if processing incomprehensible information. "But why? Everyone needs a family." "Not everyone is that lucky, little one." "Then you can be part of our family," Julia exclaimed, with the simplicity and irrefutable logic of children. "You can be our uncle." "Uncle Edward." Edward felt a lump in his throat, moved by the innocent offer. Robert quickly intervened. "Julia, Mr. Edward is a very busy man. He has his own life, his company." "It's all right, Robert," Edward interrupted, smiling at the girl. "It would be an honor to be Uncle Edward." The afternoon passed quickly, with Julia reading parts of her new book to everyone, Bea babbling happily with her mobile, and light conversations about plans for the future, a future that 48 hours earlier had seemed impossible for that family. As visiting hours were ending, Edward prepared to leave. "I'll be back tomorrow to follow the surgery," he promised. Julia accompanied him to the corridor. "Uncle Edward, can I ask you something?" "Of course, Julia." "Why don't you have children?" "Don't you like children?" The direct question, typical of childish innocence, caught Edward off guard. How to explain to a 9-year-old the complex life choices of an adult? "Actually, Julia, I've always liked children. But I spent so much time building my company that I never stopped to think about starting a family. And when I realized, a lot of time had already passed. But there's still time, isn't there? My dad says it's never too late to be happy. Edward smiled, touched by the wisdom contained in those simple words. Your father is a wise man, Julia. You look sad when you leave, the girl observed. Your house is beautiful, but it's empty, isn't it? Yes, Edward admitted, surprised by the child's perceptiveness. It's very empty. You should adopt a child like in the movies. There are lots of children who need a dad or a mom. The suggestion, made so naturally, triggered a series of thoughts in Edward that he had never seriously considered before. Adoption. He, Edward Menzies, raising a child alone. It's something to think about, Julia. Thank you for the suggestion. The girl smiled, satisfied, and hugged him once more before returning to her mother's room. Edward left the hospital with his mind full of new ideas and possibilities. On the way home, he passed a park where families were enjoying the late afternoon. Parents playing with their children, mothers pushing strollers, grandparents proudly watching their grandchildren. Everyday scenes that Edward had always ignored, focused on his next big deal. Upon arriving at his apartment, the feeling of emptiness was even more intense. Julia's observation had been spot on. The place was beautiful, luxurious, but completely devoid of life and human warmth. Edward picked up his phone and impulsively called his friend Judge Clara Reynolds. A judge in the family court. Clara. It's Edward. I need your help with something different. Edward Menzies wanting help with something that doesn't involve business? That's new, Clara joked. How can I help? I want to know about adoption. The silence on the other end of the line showed the judge's surprise. Adoption? Are you serious, Edward? I am, but I don't want to adopt on impulse. I want to understand the process, get to know the children, do it the right way. I just don't know where to start. Well, it's a complex process, especially for a single man of 50 with no experience with children, Clara explained. But it's not impossible. We'd start with a psychosocial evaluation, preparatory courses. I want to do this, Clara, truly. What happened to you, Edward? Last time we spoke, you were obsessed with Menatech's international expansion. Now you're talking about adopting a child. Edward smiled, thinking of Julia and Bea. Let's just say I had a transformative experience in the last few days. I realized that I built an empire but forgot to build a life. Well, if you're truly determined, I can help you. Come to my office tomorrow and we'll start talking about the first steps. After hanging up, Edward sat on his sofa looking at the city through the panoramic windows. The idea of adopting a child, which would have seemed absurd just 3 days ago, now presented itself as a real possibility, a new path for his life. His phone rang again. It was Denise. Mr. Menzies, the German deal documents are ready for your final signature, and the CFO is concerned about the social clause you included. He says it will significantly affect projected profits. Edward took a deep breath. Tell the CFO that Menatech doesn't exist just to generate profit. From now on, we will have a real commitment to society. Forgive my frankness, sir, but what is happening? You never cared about these things before. People change, Denise. Sometimes you need to see life through a child's eyes to see what truly matters. After hanging up, Edward picked up the drawing Julia had made, our family and our guardian angel, and smiled. Who would have thought that, at 50, Edward Menzies, the feared business shark, would learn life lessons from a 9-year-old girl? He opened his notebook and began to research adoption in the United States. The numbers were frightening. Thousands of children waiting for a home, many already older, considered unadoptable by many couples who sought only babies. Children like Julia, who would soon be too old for the adoption queue, destined to grow up in institutions. The idea started small, but grew rapidly in his mind. What if Menatech created a foundation dedicated to connecting these children with potential adoptive parents? And what if part of the profits from the German deal was directed to improve the conditions of shelters and care institutions? Edward began to make frantic notes, outlining an ambitious plan that combined his business talents with his newfound social purpose. For the first time in years, he felt truly excited about a project whose ultimate goal was not just profit. It was almost 2 a.m. when his phone rang, waking him from an involuntary nap at his desk. It was Robert. Mr. Menzies? Sorry to call so late, but Julia insisted. She had a nightmare and can't go back to sleep until she talks to you. Please put her on, Edward asked, genuinely concerned. Uncle Edward? Julia's sleepy voice came through. I dreamed you weren't coming back. That you forgot about us. Edward's heart tightened. That will never happen, Julia, I promise. I'll be there bright and early tomorrow for your mother's surgery, okay? Do you really promise? It's on my honor. Now go back to sleep. Tomorrow will be a big day. Edward hung up, deeply touched by Julia's need to hear his voice. That child, who barely knew him, already considered him an important part of her life, important enough for his absence to cause nightmares. He looked at the notes he had made, plans for a foundation, social projects, ideas for rethinking Menatech's social responsibility policy. All of this had sprung from the casual encounter with two children lost in the rain. How could life change so quickly? How could priorities built over decades rearrange themselves in just a few days? Edward didn't have all the answers, but for the first time in a long time he felt genuinely hopeful about the future. A future that perhaps included more than contracts and profits. A future with children's laughter, family dinners, and the irreplaceable feeling of being truly needed by someone. Chapter 6, Transformations, the 3 months following you. Teresa's surgery transformed Edward's life in ways he could never have predicted. The operation was a success, and recovery, though slow, progressed satisfactorily. The Allen family had become a constant presence in his life, gradually filling the void he hadn't even realized he felt so deeply. That Sunday morning, Edward adjusted his tie in front of the mirror, feeling somewhat nervous. He had been invited to Teresa's birthday lunch at the Allen family home in Liberty Hill. It would be the first time he visited their home, so different from his luxurious apartment on the Upper East Side. Should I bring more gifts than what I've already set aside? He wondered, looking at the carefully wrapped packages on the bed. He had chosen a simple but elegant necklace for Teresa, a set of books for Julia, and a musical teddy bear for Bea. He wondered if it would be too much, if it would seem ostentatious. The last thing he wanted was to make the family feel uncomfortable. The intercom rang. It was Severin, the doorman. "Mr. Menzies, your driver is waiting." "Thank you, Severin. I'm coming down." Edward had decided not to go in his Mercedes. Instead, he called a car service with a more discreet vehicle. He didn't want to attract unnecessary attention in the simple neighborhood where the Allen family lived. During the ride, he reflected on the changes in his life in recent months. Mentech had finalized the deal with the Germans, but under new conditions that prioritized social responsibility. Edward had created the New Home Foundation, dedicated to supporting children in care institutions and facilitating adoption processes. The initiative was gaining national visibility and attracting other entrepreneurs. More importantly, Edward had begun the adoption qualification process. Visits with the social worker had already started, and he attended a preparatory course for adoptive parents weekly. These were small but firm steps towards a dream he didn't even know he had until he met Julia and Bea. The car entered Liberty Hill, a working-class neighborhood in the north end of New York City. The streets were narrow, with simple houses and local shops. Children played soccer in the street, and neighbors chatted on the sidewalks. It was a world completely different from the aseptic and impersonal environment Edward was accustomed to. "It's that street on the right," Edward directed the driver, following the directions Robert had given him. The car stopped in front of a small but well-maintained house. The facade was painted light blue, with flower pots on the porch. A colorful banner with the words "Happy Birthday, Teresa" decorated the entrance. Edward got out of the car carrying the gifts. Before he could knock on the door, it opened and Julia came running out. "Uncle Edward!" "You really came." The girl hugged him enthusiastically, almost making him drop the packages. "Of course I came, Julia. I promised, didn't I?" In recent months, Edward had kept his promise to remain present in the family's life. He visited Teresa regularly during her recovery, took Julia on outings on weekends, and had even learned to change diapers and prepare bottles for Bea. "Come on in. Mommy's eager to show you the house. She's been cleaning all week." Edward entered, immediately enveloped by the aroma of homemade food. The living room was small, simply decorated, but extremely welcoming. Family photos adorned the walls, and Julia's drawings were proudly displayed on a bulletin board. Teresa came to greet him, leaning on a cane. She was still pale and thinner than usual, but her eyes shone with a vitality that wasn't present when Edward first met her at the hospital. "Edward, it's so good you came." She hugged him warmly. "Welcome to our home." Robert appeared shortly after, carrying Bea, who was now bigger and more active. The baby, seeing Edward, stretched her little arms towards him, babbling happily. "Look who recognized Uncle," Robert joked, handing his daughter to Edward. "She gets like this every time we say your name." Edward took Bea in his arms, feeling that familiar warmth in his chest. The little one grabbed his tie, fascinated by the shiny fabric. "I brought some gifts," Edward said, handing the packages to Robert. "I hope it's not too much." "You already do so much for us," Teresa protested. "You didn't need to bring anything." "Please, it's a pleasure." "Happy birthday, Teresa." The room was soon filled with exclamations of joy as the gifts were opened. Julia hugged the books against her chest, promising to read them all before the end of the month. Teresa was visibly moved by the necklace, asking Robert to help her put it on immediately. "Come, Edward, I'll show you the rest of the house." Teresa invited, proud of her home. The house was small, 3 bedrooms, a compact kitchen, a single bathroom, but every space had been lovingly and creatively utilized. The girls' room was especially charming, decorated with colorful mobiles and shelves filled with books. "Julia told us you started the adoption process," Teresa commented as they returned to the living room. "Is that true?" Edward nodded. "Yes, I'm still at the beginning of the process. It's long and complicated, but I'm determined. I think it's admirable," she said sincerely. "Many children need a home, someone to love them." Actually, it was Julia who planted the idea. She asked me why I didn't have children, and I realized I didn't have a good answer. Teresa smiled. "My daughter has that gift of asking the right questions. Sometimes the most difficult ones." In the kitchen, Robert finished the preparations for lunch. The delicious smell of stew filled the air. "I hope you like home cooking," he said, stirring the steaming pot. "This is Teresa's special recipe, famous throughout the neighborhood." "I'm looking forward to trying it," Edward replied sincerely. "It's been years since I've had real homemade stew." Lunch was served at the small living room table, extended with an improvised board to accommodate everyone. Edward sat between Julia and Teresa, with Bea in a high chair beside him. The meal proceeded amidst lively conversations and laughter. Edward spoke about the progress of the foundation he had created and how it had changed Menatech's culture. Robert talked about his new job as an executive driver, proud to be able to support his family honestly again. "The best part is the flexible schedule," he explained. "I can take Julia to school and be home when Teresa needs to go to medical appointments." "And how is the treatment going?" Edward asked Teresa. "Progressing well. The doctors say that in 3 more months I'll be able to teach again, even if part-time." "There's no rush," Robert interjected. "First, your complete recovery." Edward watched the family's interaction with a mix of joy and a hint of envy. There was so much love in that small house, so much complicity. His luxurious apartment on the Upper East Side seemed cold and lifeless in comparison. After dessert, a delicious chocolate cake made by Julia with her mother's help, everyone sat on the small porch to enjoy the afternoon breeze. Bea slept in Edward's lap, who had developed a surprising ability to calm her. "You have a way with children," Teresa observed. "You'll be a great father." "I hope so. I still have a lot to learn." Julia, who was flipping through one of the new books, looked up. "Uncle Edward, when you adopt a child, can we play together?" "I can teach you lots of things." Edward smiled. "Of course, Julia. You'll always be welcome in my house." "Maybe you'll adopt a girl my age, then we can be friends." The idea made Edward reflect. During the adoption orientation sessions, he had been informed that most candidates sought babies or very young children. Older children, especially those over 7, had drastically reduced chances of finding a family. "You know, Julia, you might be right. A girl your age would be wonderful." The sun began to set when Edward decided it was time to go. He said goodbye to the family with a promise to return the following weekend. "Don't forget, you're taking me to the museum next Saturday," Julia reminded him, hugging him tightly. "I won't forget," Edward promised, returning the hug. On the way back home, Edward felt different. The simple afternoon with the Allen family had been more gratifying than many sophisticated dinners and business meetings throughout his career. There was an authenticity in those relationships that he had never experienced in his usual social circle. Upon entering his apartment, the feeling of emptiness was even more intense. Julia's observation had been spot on. The place was beautiful, luxurious, but completely devoid of life and human warmth. Edward went directly to his office. He had made a decision. He picked up the phone and called Clara, the family court judge. "Clara?" "Edward Menzies. I want to amend my request in the adoption process. I'm interested in older children, specifically between 8 and 10 years old." "That's excellent news, Edward. We have many children in that age range who rarely find families. But are you sure? Older children bring specific challenges." "I'm absolutely sure. And if possible, I'd like to start the approximation stage as soon as possible." "Well, that speeds up the process quite a bit. There's one particular girl I think you should meet. Marion, 9 years old. She's been in the shelter for 4 years, since she lost her mother. She's intelligent, likes books, but has difficulty trusting people because of the abandonment she suffered." Edward felt his heart race. "When can I meet her? We can schedule a first visit for next week if you're available." "I'll be available." "Thank you, Clara." After hanging up, Edward walked to the window, watching the city light up as night fell. His life, which for so many years had followed a predictable path of ambition and material achievements, was now taking surprising turns. The idea of having a daughter, of being a father, filled him with a mix of exhilaration and apprehension. Was he prepared for this challenge? Would he know how to be the father a child like Marion needed? His phone rang. It was Denise. "Mr. Menzies, the documents for the German deal are ready for your final signature, and the CFO is concerned about the social clause you included. He says it will significantly affect projected profits." Edward took a deep breath. "Tell the CFO that Millionaire doesn't exist just to generate profit. From now on, we will have a real commitment to society. Forgive my frankness, sir, but what is happening? I've never cared about these things before. People change, Denise. Sometimes you need to see life through a child's eyes to see what truly matters." After hanging up, Edward picked up the drawing Julia had made, "Our Family and Our Guardian Angel," and smiled. Who would have thought that at 50, Edward Menzies, the feared business shark, would learn life lessons from a 9-year-old girl? He opened his notebook and began to research adoption in the United States. The numbers were frightening. Thousands of children waiting for a home, many already older, considered unadoptable by many couples who sought only babies. Children like Julia, who would soon be too old for the adoption queue, destined to grow up in institutions. The idea started small, but grew rapidly in his mind. What if Millionaire created a foundation dedicated to connecting these children with potential adoptive parents? And what if part of the profits from the German deal was directed to improve the conditions of shelters and care institutions? Edward began to make frantic notes, outlining an ambitious plan that combined his business talents with his newfound social purpose. For the first time in years, he felt truly excited about a project whose ultimate goal was not just profit. It was almost 2 in the morning when his phone rang, waking him from an involuntary nap at his desk. It was Robert. "Mr. Menzies. Sorry to call so late, but Julia insisted. She had a nightmare and can't go back to sleep until she talks to you. Please put her on," Edward asked, genuinely concerned. "Uncle Edward?" Julia's sleepy voice came through. "I dreamed you weren't coming back, that you forgot about us." Edward's heart tightened. "That will never happen, Julia, I promise. I'll be there bright and early tomorrow for your mother's surgery, okay?" Do you really promise?" "Ferratu on my honor. Now go back to sleep. Tomorrow will be a big day." Edward hung up, deeply touched by Julia's need to hear his voice. That child, who barely knew him, already considered him an important part of her life, important enough for his absence to cause nightmares. He looked at the notes he had made, plans for a foundation, social projects, ideas for rethinking Millionaire's social responsibility policy. All of this had sprung from the casual encounter with 2 children lost in the rain. How could life change so quickly? How could priorities built over decades rearrange themselves in just a few days? Edward didn't have all the answers, but for the first time in a long time he felt genuinely hopeful about the future. A future that perhaps included more than contracts and profits. A future with children's laughter, family dinners, and the irreplaceable feeling of being truly needed by someone. Chapter 77. Eternal Bonds. A year had passed since that rainy night that had forever changed Edward Menzies' life. It was a sunny Saturday morning, and Central Park was filled with families enjoying the pleasant weather. Edward walked hand in hand with Marion, his 10-year-old daughter, recently adopted after months of approximation and adaptation. "Dad, look! It's Julia." Marion pointed animatedly to a girl waving frantically from afar. Edward's heart warmed at hearing the word "Dad." It was still a novelty that moved him every time Marion pronounced it. He waved back at Julia, who came running towards him, followed by Robert, Teresa, and Bea, who was now taking her first steps, happily wobbling across the grass. "Murray!" "Uncle Edward!" Julia hugged both of them with enthusiasm. "You arrived early. Marion was eager to show you her new book," Edward explained, affectionately ruffling his daughter's hair. The two girls had developed an instant friendship since their first meeting 6 months earlier. They shared a love for books, fertile imaginations, and a wisdom that seemed beyond their years. For Edward, seeing this bond form was one of the greatest joys of his new life. Teresa approached, looking healthy and refreshed. The surgery had been a complete success, and she had returned to work as a teacher a few months ago. "How are the party preparations going?" she asked as Robert joined them, carrying a picnic basket. "Everything's ready," Edward replied. "The judge confirmed he'll be there on Monday for the official formalization of the adoption." Monday would be a special day, Marion's final adoption hearing, followed by a celebration at Edward's new house. Yes, a new house. He had sold the Upper East Side apartment, considering it cold and unsuitable for raising a child, and bought a cozy house in Pine Ridge Heights, with a garden, trees, and space for Marion to grow and play. "I'm so happy for you both," Teresa said, gently squeezing Edward's arm. "Marion is a wonderful girl, and you've become an incredible father." Edward looked to where the girls were playing, teaching Bea to blow bubbles. Marion laughed openly, a sound that, when he first met her, was extremely rare. The shy and distrustful girl from the shelter had transformed into a joyful and secure child. "I never imagined it would be possible to love someone so deeply in such a short time," Edward confessed. "From the first day at the shelter, when she showed me her poetry notebook, it was like something clicked into place." Robert smiled, placing the basket on the ground and beginning to spread the picnic blanket. "That's how it works. It's not about blood or DNA, it's about connection, about choosing to love and protect." The group settled down for the picnic, with the children alternating between playing and small bites of food. Edward watched the scene with a feeling of gratitude so profound that sometimes it seemed difficult to contain. "How's business?" Robert asked, passing a lemonade to Edward. "Still traveling less?" Edward nodded. "I've delegated much more than I used to. Bantech continues to grow, but now I have other priorities." He looked at Marion tenderly. "I don't want to miss any important moments." The change in Edward's professional life had surprised the market. The ruthless executive, known for his obsessive dedication to work, now left promptly at 5 p.m. to pick up his daughter from school. International meetings were carefully scheduled, not to coincide with school presentations or weekends. And even more impressively, the New Home Foundation had become a national model for adoption assistance, helping dozens of children find loving families. "I heard the foundation is going to receive a government award," Teresa commented. "Yes, next week. But the real award is seeing children find homes." Edward paused, reflecting. "You know, sometimes I wonder what would have happened if Julia hadn't misdialed my number that night." "It wasn't a mistake," Julia said, who had apparently been paying attention to the adults' conversation. "It was destiny." The adults laughed at the certainty with which the girl, now 10 years old, had made the statement. But Edward couldn't help but think that perhaps she was right. How else to explain the series of coincidences that had led him there? "You know what else impresses me, Edward?" Teresa said, watching the girls play. "How completely you embrace this new life. Many men in your position would have helped financially and moved on, but you really got involved, changed your priorities." Edward smiled, remembering the man he had been just a year before. "Actually, it was easy. When you find something that fills a void you didn't even know existed, there's no going back." Edward's cell phone rang. It was Denise, his secretary. "Mr. Menzies, I'm sorry to bother you on a Saturday, but the Japanese executives insist on rescheduling the video conference for Monday." "Monday is impossible, Denise. It's the adoption hearing day, remember?" I explained that to them. but they're threatening to cancel the deal if we can't accommodate them. A year ago, Edward would have cancelled any personal commitment to save a deal of that magnitude. Now the answer came without hesitation. Then cancel it. There are things more important than contracts. As he hung up, he noticed Robert, Teresa, and the girls watching him with smiles. "What is it? Do I have something on my face?" he asked, confused. "No," Teresa replied. "It's just that—" "You've really changed, Edward." He shrugged, a little embarrassed. "For the better, I hope." "Without a doubt," Robert said, getting up to serve more drinks. "From business shark to father of the year. Who would have thought?" The afternoon passed peacefully, with games, conversations, and much laughter. As the sun began to set, illuminating the park with golden hues, the families prepared to leave. "Don't forget, Monday after the hearing, everyone's at my place for the party," Edward reminded them, hugging Julia and Bea goodbye. "We wouldn't miss it for anything," Teresa assured him, hugging him warmly. "We're so happy for you." On the way home, Marion was unusually quiet, observing the city through the car window. "Is everything all right, sweetheart?" Edward asked, concerned by his daughter's silence. "I'm just thinking, after Monday it's going to be official, right? I'm going to be a real Menzies." Edward parked the car and turned to look into his daughter's eyes. "Mari, you're already a Menzies in everything that matters. The judge is just going to formalize what our hearts already know." The girl smiled, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "I know, but it's good to be sure. Do you have any concerns about Monday?" "We can talk about it." Marion hesitated, playing with the bracelet Julia had given her as a gift. "What if one day you get tired of being a dad? What if you find out you preferred your old life, just working and traveling?" The question hit Edward like a punch. Despite all the love and security he tried to provide, the fear of abandonment still haunted Marion. Understandable considering her past, but painful to hear. "Look at me, Mari," he asked, gently holding the girl's hands. "Before I met you, I had a huge empty house. I had money, power, business success, but I came home to a silent apartment every night. There was no one waiting for me, no one to share joys or sorrows with. Now I have you. I have a brilliant, sensitive, incredible daughter. I know it sounds strange for an adult to say this to a child, but you saved me, Mari. You gave meaning to my life." The girl hugged him tightly. "I love you, Dad. I love you too, my little one. More than I ever imagined I was capable of loving anyone." That night, after putting Marion to bed, Edward sat in the office of his new house, looking at Julia's framed drawing, Our Family and Our Guardian Angel, which now occupied a prominent place on his desk. Next to the drawing, there was a recent photo: Edward, Marion, the Allen family, and Clara, the judge who had facilitated the adoption process, all smiling on a Sunday afternoon. A new family, formed not by blood ties but by choices, coincidences, and that mysterious force Julia called destiny. Edward opened his laptop and began to write an email to Menatech's board of directors. For weeks, he had been considering a significant change in his professional life, and now he was determined to implement it. "Dear board members," he began typing, "after careful consideration, I would like to propose a restructuring in Menatech's leadership. I will remain as chairman of the board, but I wish to nominate Carla Peterson for the position of CEO. It was a decision that would have seemed unthinkable a year ago. Edward Menzies, Menatech's founder, voluntarily stepping away from the daily management of the company he had built from scratch. Impossible, but the Edward of now had other priorities. He wanted to be present for every important moment in Marion's life. He wanted to expand the work of the New Home Foundation, helping more children find families. He wanted to enjoy Sundays in the park with the Allens, watching Julia and Marion grow up together as sisters of the heart. Monday would be the day he officially became a father. But in truth, the real miracle had happened much earlier, that rainy night when a wrong call put him on the path of two lost girls, forever changing the course of his life. The Edward Menzies who existed before that night, cold, lonely, obsessed with material success, now seemed like a stranger. In his place, there was a man who had learned that the true value of life was not in professional achievements or material possessions, but in human connections, in the privilege of loving and being loved. On Monday morning, Edward woke up before his alarm clock, feeling a mixture of anxiety and joy. Today, before the law, Marion would officially become his daughter. He walked silently to her bedroom door and peeked in. The girl was still sleeping, hugging the teddy bear he had given her on the first day of visiting the shelter. "Mary," he called softly, sitting on the edge of the bed. "Time to wake up, sweetheart. Today's the big day." The girl slowly opened her eyes, smiling when she saw Edward. "Good morning, Dad." "Good morning, my princess. Ready to officially become a Menzies?" Marion sat up in bed, suddenly completely awake. "More than ready." That morning, before leaving for the courthouse, Edward received a phone call from Clara, the judge. "Edward, I'm just calling to make sure everything's in order. The psychologist submitted the last report yesterday, and everything is perfect. I've never seen such a successful adaptation in such a short time." "Thank you, Clara. Without you, none of this would be possible." "You and Marion did all the work. I just helped open some doors. Did you know she wrote a poem about you?" "The social worker showed me." Edward felt a lump in his throat. "She didn't tell me. It's probably a surprise. It's truly moving to see how you two connected. You know, Edward, when you called me that day talking about adoption, I confess I had my doubts. A single businessman of 50, with no experience with children, wanting to adopt. It seemed improbable. I would have doubted it myself a year ago," Edward admitted. "Exactly. But it only took seeing you two together for the first time to understand that there was something special there. Sometimes the most beautiful families are those that destiny builds through unexpected paths." Upon arriving at the courthouse with Marion, Edward was surprised by the number of people waiting for them. Not only the Allen family, but also Denise and several colleagues from Menatech, employees from the New Home Foundation, and even a small group of children from the shelter where Marion had lived. "I can't believe so many people came," Marion murmured, holding Edward's hand tightly, visibly moved. "Everyone wanted to be present for this special moment," Edward replied, equally touched. Before they entered the courtroom, an elderly lady approached them. Edward recognized her as Mrs. Carmen, the director of the shelter where Marion had lived. "Marion, my dear," she said, hugging the girl affectionately. "What a wonderful moment. I brought something for you." She handed Marion a photo album. "These are your memories from the shelter. Your friends, the parties, the outings, so you never forget where you came from." The girl flipped through the album with tear-filled eyes. "Thank you, Mrs. Carmen. I'll never forget. And I brought something for you too, Mr. Menzies." The lady handed Edward an envelope. "These are the first poems Marion wrote when she arrived at the shelter. I kept them all these years. I thought you would like to know a little more about the beginning of your daughter's journey." Edward accepted the envelope with trembling hands, deeply touched by the gesture. "Mr. Menzies," Mrs. Carmen continued, "the work you are doing with the foundation, it's changing lives. Just this month, 3 of our older children found families, thanks to your programs to encourage late adoption. It's the least I can do. Mrs. Carmen, Marion taught me that there are incredible treasures waiting for families who dare to look beyond adopting babies." The hearing itself was a solemn and moving moment. The judge, Judge Marcus Brown, a middle-aged man with kind eyes behind his glasses, greeted everyone with a welcoming smile. The courtroom, normally cold and formal, had been decorated with small flower arrangements, a personal touch Clara had provided to make the moment even more special. "We are here today," Judge Marcus began, "to formalize something that, from what I can observe, has already been a reality for some time: the formation of a family." He gave a short speech about the meaning of adoption, about how love transcends biological ties, and how in his long career in family court, few cases had moved him as much as Edward and Marion's. What we have here is a perfect example of how adoption should be: a meeting of souls, a deep connection that equally benefits both child and adult. So it's not about charity or altruism, but about mutual and transformative love. The judge invited Marion to speak if she wished. The girl, normally shy in formal situations, stood up with a paper in her hand. "I wrote a poem," she announced, her voice slightly trembling. "If I may read it." "Of course, Marion," the judge encouraged. The girl took a deep breath and began. "Alone in the darkness, I waited without knowing, a father I never met, a family I couldn't have. Then one day you appeared, with kind eyes and a sincere smile. You didn't promise worlds or treasures, but you gave me something much truer. A home, a hug, a chance to love, to be loved exactly as I am. Today I am no longer that lost girl. I am Marion Menzies, the daughter you found." There wasn't a dry eye in the room when she finished. Edward, unable to hold back his tears, hugged his daughter with all the love he never imagined he was capable of feeling. The judge, visibly moved, cleared his throat before continuing. "Well, I think after that any formality seems superfluous," he smiled, picking up his pen. "But we have an important document to sign." When he finally signed the documents, officially declaring Marion Edwards' daughter, the room erupted in applause. "Now it's official," the judge said, smiling. "Marion Menzies." The girl hugged Edward so tightly she almost knocked him over. "Thank you for choosing me, Dad." "I didn't choose you, Mari," he replied, his voice choked with emotion. "It was you who chose me, who taught me to be a father. I just had the luck to be in the right place at the right time." The Allen family was the first to approach for hugs. Julia cried with emotion, clinging to her mother. Robert, usually so reserved, discreetly wiped away a tear. Bea, now 15 months old, clapped her hands without fully understanding what was happening, but caught up in the joy around her. "Now we're real cousins," Julia exclaimed, hugging Marion. The party at the new house was a warm and joyful event. The spacious garden had been decorated with colorful lights and balloons. A huge banner read, "Officially welcome Marion Menzies." In the center, a table with a cake decorated with sugar books, a tribute to the girl's passion for reading. Edward had hired a caterer, but made a point of personally preparing a special dish. The macaroni and cheese, he had discovered, was Marion's favorite in their first days together. The girl was radiant to see her father proudly serving his own culinary creation. "You made the macaroni," she exclaimed, delighted. "I tried," Edward laughed. "I don't know if it's as good as Mrs. Carmen's at the shelter, but I made it with a lot of love." "It's the best macaroni in the world because you made it," the girl replied, with the simplicity and sincerity that so charmed Edward. Guests circulated through the garden, many still emotional from the ceremony. Several children from the shelter played in the small recreation area Edward had set up, especially for the occasion. Denise, the secretary who had become a close friend, took photos of everything. "Mr. Menzies," Denise approached, "who would have thought that call a year ago would change our lives so much? The company has never been so humanized and productive at the same time. Because we finally understood what truly matters." "Denise, people." Clara the judge chatted animatedly with Robert and Teresa. Edward approached the group. "Edward," Clara called, "I was telling Robert and Teresa about the impact your foundation is having. The number of late adoptions has increased by 30% in the last 6 months. It's impressive." "The credit isn't mine," Edward replied modestly. "It's the dedicated team we assembled, and stories like Marion's, which inspire others to open their hearts." "You're being modest," Teresa interjected. "Robert told me how you've used your influence to change the mindset of other entrepreneurs. That article in Time magazine about the CEO who discovered fatherhood at 50 inspired many people." Edward blushed slightly. The article had been Denise's idea as a way to publicize the New Home Foundation. He had initially resisted, always averse to personal exposure, but eventually agreed, realizing that his story could encourage other adoptions. "Speaking of which," Clara continued, "I received 3 adoption applications this week from entrepreneurs who cited you as inspiration. One of them even mentioned that if Edward Menzies can balance the presidency of a multinational with single parenthood, anyone can." Edward laughed. "Well, it's not exactly single. I have a lot of help." He looked around at the support network he had built. Denise, who had reorganized his entire schedule to prioritize Marion's school commitments. Robert and Teresa, who were always available for parenting advice. The school teachers, who had welcomed him without prejudice into the predominantly female world of parent-teacher meetings. In a corner of the garden, Marion proudly showed her room to Julia and some friends from the shelter. Edward observed how his daughter had transformed in recent months. The shy and distrustful girl now radiated confidence and joy. "You know what else impresses me about you, Edward?" Teresa said, following his gaze. "It's how you never tried to buy her love with expensive gifts or privileges. I've seen so many parents try to compensate for absence with money. I quickly learned that what she really needed was time and presence," Edward replied. "All those years in the shelter, What Marion dreamed of most wasn't toys or trendy clothes, but someone who would simply be there for her. Who would show up at school presentations? Who would listen about her day? Who would read stories before bed? "You're a natural father," Robert commented. "As if you'd done it your whole life." Edward smiled, watching Marion laugh with her friends. "It's because I found the right daughter." As the afternoon progressed, more and more guests approached to congratulate Edward and Marion. Colleagues from Menatech, school teachers, neighbors who had quickly become friends. The house, which weeks before was just an empty and impersonal building, now overflowed with life and human warmth. In a moment of tranquility, while the children played in the garden, Edward found himself alone with Teresa on the porch. "So," she said, watching Marion and Julia build a sandcastle for Bea, "how does it feel to be officially a father?" Edward smiled, contemplating the scene. "Like I've found the purpose of my existence. As if everything before this was just preparation for this moment." Teresa nodded, understanding. "You know what Julia told me last night? That you're no longer our guardian angel, but part of the family. That her drawing needs to be updated." Edward laughed, moved by the observation of the girl who had unknowingly transformed his life. "She's as perceptive as ever." "There's a question I've always wanted to ask, Edward," Teresa said after a moment of silence. "Why did you help us that day? Why did you care so much about two unknown children that you risked a multi-million-dollar deal?" Edward reflected for a moment, watching the children play. "Honestly, I can't even fully explain it myself. When I found Julia holding Bea in that rain, something inside me awakened, as if I had been sleeping for decades and finally woke up to what truly matters." Teresa smiled, understanding. "Sometimes people come into our lives exactly when we need them, even if we didn't know we needed them. Like a wrong number dialed on a rainy night?" Edward suggested, smiling. "Exactly," Teresa agreed. "Some call it coincidence. Others, destiny. I prefer to call it a miracle." At that moment, Marion ran up to them, her face radiant with happiness. "Dad, Julia had an amazing idea. Can we camp in the garden tonight, please?" Edward exchanged a knowing look with Teresa before answering his daughter. "Of course, Mari. That sounds like a great way to celebrate our big day." As Marion ran back to tell Julia the news, Edward felt a deep certainty in his heart. His life, which for so many years had been defined by professional achievements and material possessions, now had a new center of gravity. A center made of children's laughter, spontaneous hugs, bedtime stories, and the certainty of being needed, of being loved. As dusk advanced, Edward and Robert began to set up tents in the garden for the impromptu campout. The girls helped animatedly, running to fetch pillows, blankets, and flashlights. "Dad, can we make a bonfire?" Marion asked, her eyes sparkling with anticipation. A real bonfire might not be safe," Edward replied thoughtfully. "But I have a better idea." He disappeared into the house for a few minutes, returning with several jars of LED lights he had bought to decorate the garden for the party. He arranged them in a circle in the center of the tents, creating an effect that mimicked the soft glow of a bonfire. "Wow, it looks magical," Julia exclaimed, amazed. "And the best part, no fire hazard," Robert commented, laughing. The children gathered around the improvised bonfire. Teresa brought cookies and hot chocolate, completing the camping atmosphere. "Does anyone know any camping stories?" Julia asked. "No scary stories," Edward preempted, knowing well the frightening repertoire children usually loved to share on these occasions. "We have Bea here. How about a true story?" Teresa suggested. "About how it all began? How it all began?" Marion inquired, curious. "Yes," Teresa replied with a smile. "The story of how your father found Julia and Bea on a rainy night, and how it changed all our lives." The girls settled in, eager to hear the story that, even though they already knew it, they never tired of listening to. Edward and Robert also sat down, as Teresa began to narrate the events of that fateful night, almost a year ago. "It was a rainy night in New York City," she began in a storyteller's voice. Julia and Bea were alone, under the awning of a closed store. Their father, trying to get money for their mother's surgery, had gotten into trouble. As Teresa narrated, Edward observed the attentive faces. Julia occasionally interrupted to add details from her perspective. "I was so scared. And then Uncle Edward appeared like a prince on a white horse, except it was a black car, Laughter echoed in the garden. Edward realized how that story, which had begun so dramatically, could now be told with smiles and comical interjections. Time had transformed a moment of despair into a landmark, the beginning of something beautiful. And then, Teresa continued, reaching the present, everything fell into place as it should. Today we are a big extended family. A chosen family, Robert added. Exactly, Edward agreed. A family we formed not out of obligation, but out of choice, out of love. When the children finally fell asleep in the tents, Julia and Marion in one, Robert and Teresa with Bea in another, Edward remained sitting outside, contemplating the starry New York City sky, rarely visible due to light pollution, but exceptionally clear that night. Robert joined him, offering a glass of wine. "The kids are asleep." "We deserve this." Edward accepted the drink with a smile. "Thank you for being here today. It means a lot to us." "We're family now," Robert replied simply. "We're connected forever." The two men remained silent for a few moments, enjoying the tranquility of the night. Their lives were so different a year ago. Edward, the powerful solitary businessman. Robert, the desperate driver trying to save his wife. Now they shared much more than a friendship. They shared an improbable family bond, forged in the most unusual circumstances. "Sometimes I wonder," Edward finally said, "what my life would have been like if I hadn't answered that call." Robert shook his head. "It wasn't a coincidence, Edward. Julia swore she had dialed the right number I gave her. Maybe it was meant to happen. As Julia says, destiny. Or a guardian angel," Robert added, raising his glass. "A toast to the city's newest official father." Edward accepted the toast, but his gaze remained fixed on the stars for a moment before resting on the tent where Marion slept. A wave of gratitude washed over him, so intense it almost hurt. "Actually," he said, raising his glass, "a toast to the children who teach us the true meaning of life, to the wrong calls that turn out to be exactly the right ones, and to the families we form along the way, not out of obligation or blood, but out of choice and love." The glasses clinked, sealing not only the celebration of that special day, but the extraordinary journey that had begun with a simple call on a rainy night. A call that proved that sometimes life's greatest treasures are found in the most unexpected places. Later, when Robert returned to the tent to join his wife and youngest daughter, Edward made one last round of the garden, checking that everything was safe. He stopped for a moment at the tent where Marion and Julia slept, listening to the girls' soft breaths. "Thank you," he whispered to the universe, to destiny, to whatever force had conspired to bring those children into his life. As he entered the house to get another blanket, for the night was growing chilly, Edward stopped before the picture frame with Julia's original drawing, "Our family and our guardian angel." Beside it, there was now a new drawing made by Marion and Julia together, "Our big family." In it, all the figures held hands, Edward, Marion, Teresa, Robert, Julia, and Bea, forming a circle under a radiant sun. Edward smiled, touched by the simplicity and depth of that representation. There was no longer a guardian angel, nor separate people, just a family, united by bonds that transcended blood or convention. Back in the garden, Edward settled into a lounge chair near the tents. He didn't want to sleep inside the house away from the children. He preferred to be there under the stars, near his new family. He covered himself with the blanket and let the peace of that moment fill every space of his being. And as the night advanced over the new Menzies home, now truly a home, Edward knew with absolute certainty, that he would never be alone again. The life he had built before, but of material success, but emotionally arid, had given way to something infinitely more valuable, a life rich in human connections, in unconditional love, in purpose. It was not the end of a journey, but the beginning of many others. There would be challenges ahead, of course. Parenthood was not an easy path, especially for someone starting so late. Marion still carried emotional scars from the abandonment she had suffered. Adolescence would come with its own complexities, but now Edward had something he had never had before, a reason to face each new day with hope and joy. A reason that slept peacefully in the tent next door, dreaming of books, poems, and all the possibilities that life now offered him. "Good night, my daughter," Edward whispered, closing his eyes. "Good night, family." And so, under the starry New York City sky, rested not only a man transformed by love, but a new beginning for all those whom destiny, or a simple misdialed number, had brought together in a way as improbable as it was perfect.